Sirens are sounding among the sharp bursts of the .5 caliber machine guns and the powerful sound of the propellers. "Torpedo spotted! Torpedo spotted!" yells the announcer. Moments later, there's a blast, followed by another one. Things are not going as expected today. The excerpt above illustrates a typical experience of engaging in Task Force Admiral, the fresh naval warfare game released by MicroProse. The action takes place during the sweltering summer of 1942, as American and Japanese carrier fleets battled for a significant edge in the fight for dominance over the Pacific. I first heard about Task Force Admiral a couple of years back, when all that was shown were a few clips of F-4F Wildcat planes flying in formation. Now that the game is available in early access, we can finally evaluate this impressive title.
The Operations Room. Task Force Admiral is a particularly striking entry in the real-time strategy genre. Even though you have access to maps and 3D visuals, most of the game unfolds after the planning phase, with very little direct control over your individual units. Every order takes several minutes to execute, and no element operates in isolation. The limited number of inputs may feel dull at first, but that changes once you realize how your carefully planned torpedo bomber mission has delayed the launch of your fighter aircraft. Enemy bomber forces are now about to break through, and poor planning will be to blame. The seemingly slow pace is a defining feature of naval operations, and this tradition is carried on in naval strategy games ranging from Dangerous Waters to Rule the Waves 3. Once you grow accustomed to the downtime between issuing commands, you begin to understand why it exists. You need that time to think. I could go on at length about the game's details in a dry, technical way, but the best way to understand Task Force Admiral is simply to play the Battle of Midway scenario.
Midway, June 4th, 1942, 3 o'clock.
About 400 kilometers to the north, Midway Atoll marked the northernmost point of the Hawaiian Islands. In less than 2 hours, Task Forces 16 and 17 would encounter a large Japanese strike force attempting to seize the island. Our mission was to prevent this from happening. Operations were being directed from the flagship of Task Force 17, the USS Yorktown. Yorktown was sailing roughly 80 kilometers ahead of Task Force 16, which included the USS Hornet and USS Enterprise. Each of these carriers typically carried 4 squadrons: a fighter squadron of F-4F Wildcats, 2 dive bomber squadrons of SBD Dauntless aircraft, and a group of TBD Devastator torpedo bombers. In 1942, carrier battles were fought during the day, so the hours before dawn were best spent on planning and preparation. The essence of carrier warfare is delivering enough firepower to sink the enemy carrier, but achieving that requires far more than simply pressing a button. The seemingly low number of inputs may feel dull, but it actually leads to highly tense and exciting missions. Before you can sink a ship, you need to know its location, and for that you rely on reconnaissance aircraft. I selected 2 Dauntless bombers from Yorktown and sent them out to scan separate sectors, then set up several combat air patrols ahead of the fleet. Now that we had 3 carriers, I decided to prioritize. Task Force 17, positioned at the forward point, would likely be the first to engage, as enemy reconnaissance planes would spot them first, but they also held the initiative. As soon as we received reports from the recon planes, we would launch all available dive bombers from Yorktown under full escort. This would leave only 2 pairs of Wildcats on the carrier, but I was willing to take the risk. By making contact with a major force, I hoped to force the Japanese carriers to scramble their fighters in response. The Wildcats were there to avoid being easy targets and to inflict damage on the Zeros. Since most fighters were assigned to defend the carriers and the ships were busy maneuvering, I aimed to reduce the impact of the Japanese strike. Fewer defensive aircraft would leave the incoming attack waves more exposed and increase the chances of success for our follow-up strikes. From Task Force 16, the USS Enterprise would also launch a dive bomber group, this time with only 6 protective fighters. The rest of the force would patrol around Task Force 16 and closer to Task Force 17. Meanwhile, the USS Hornet would send its SBDs unescorted, keeping all fighters on deck to prepare for the approaching mass air attack. The torpedo bombers remained in reserve for now, especially since they could not reach range in the pre-dawn light.
Power of thought. Admiral. All of this happened without a single bullet being fired. When I finished preparing the orders, it was still dark, and I went outside to watch the waves from the USS Yorktown while the magic of accelerated time worked. Within a few minutes, everything began. The aircraft carriers turned into the wind, reconnaissance and patrol planes took off, and the deck crews prepared the bombers and their escort planes.
An hour later, they too were on their way to meet their fate. Once the aircraft were out of visual and radar range of the ship, it was no longer possible for me to know their position or status. Realistic yet stressful at the same time, one of my favorite games, like Radio Commander. I was now mostly occupied with observing and occasional management. There was nothing else I could do. When a Japanese reconnaissance plane approached the ship, the combat air patrol from the Yorktown quickly drove it away, but I could not prevent it from reporting our position. From the deck management menu, I ordered all remaining combat aircraft on the carrier to be brought to the deck. Having them ready saves time when the inevitable Japanese attack comes, as they can take off immediately without having to move other planes out of the way. The die was cast. The outcome of the battle would now be largely determined by all the decisions made up to this point. The seas calmed again, but my mind was in turmoil.
Hostile contacts and interface.
Task Force Admiral's design choices consistently favor realism, which is generally a good thing, but in some cases this approach can create problems. Thanks to the buttons at the top, it is possible to switch between the map and the 3D view. However, selecting and tracking a specific unit, if it is not a friendly ship, is quite difficult. While this prevents you from cheating by spying on the enemy, it also breaks realism in another way, because you only receive information from your bombers in the form of bombing impact reports. If reconnaissance aircraft could report that a ship was on fire, capsizing, or sinking, this would allow for post-strike damage assessment missions. That in turn would enable you to decide whether to commit reserves or withdraw. All of this happened without a single shot being fired. Once I was aboard the USS Yorktown, I immediately realized that I would not have the chance to watch the cute little planes take off. The Dauntless aircraft from the USS Hornet reported a large enemy air attack heading toward us. The announcement system broadcast a general quarters call, followed by the sound of the ship's pipes in the 3D view. Fighter control vectored all combat air patrol fighters toward the enemy group, but the size of the incoming force was more than they could handle. The call was obvious: scramble all fighters. The remaining Wildcats made their final preparations. The ships turned into the wind, and within moments, about 20 fighters were climbing into the sky to meet the Japanese force. Now we were racing against time, and I had no say in the matter. The first fighters to take off engaged the torpedo and dive bombers, and every minute brought reports of victories, but it felt like trying to drink the ocean through a straw. We managed to send enough fighters, but would they shoot down the bombers in time? Would our own bombers survive a possible interception? At that moment, the difference between the Japanese commander and myself was minimal. He was probably asking the very same questions. It seemed that the wave of Wildcats reached the enemy just in time, and the fight turned into a slaughter. From the bridge, I could watch Japanese bombers falling in flames as they approached the task force, but seeing 3 D-3A Val dive bombers pushing through the curtain of shipborne anti-aircraft fire toward the carrier turned that joy into despair. We were going to be hit.
The anatomy of a dive bomber attack.
The climax of each turn in Task Force Admiral begins when the strike group reaches its target. First, you hear the roar of the 5-inch guns, leaving a visible trail of smoke over the target area. Then comes the unsettling rise of aircraft engines. Small dots gradually transform into the unmistakable silhouettes of bombers with long wings and sleek noses. They look slow and helpless, and you always wonder how a plane can survive crashing through this wall of bullets. As the aircraft pass nearly overhead, the captain calls for evasive action, and the helmsman acknowledges, turning the large ship as tightly as possible. This overlaps with the firing of smaller 20mm and .50 caliber guns, adding to the cacophony. What makes this bloody orchestration so mesmerizing and terrifying is the exceptional work in graphics and sound design in Task Force Admiral. From the bridge, I could watch Japanese bombers falling in flames as they approached the carrier group, but this joy quickly turned to disbelief. As the engines roar, you realize they have you in their sights. One by one, like flowers blooming, the bombers break formation and begin their dives. Explosive shells spread upward. Occasionally, a fighter plane you sent in pursuit follows down after them. Those few seconds stretch like an eternity, and you silently pray for a lucky shot at the last moment. Most of the time, that chance never comes. Today was one of those times. 3 bombs hit the target, landing on the flight deck and starting a fire. The always helpful status menu indicated that it was a major blaze, and indeed, it looked that way. The most worrying aspect was that the damaged sections were irreparably wrecked. I thought this meant Yorktown could not be used for air operations, but to my relief, critical operations were not yet affected. The guns continued firing at the Japanese bombers, which were being chased by our fighters, but after a few minutes, silence fell. The fire was also extinguished. It was as if the entire event had never happened. Had the fighters taken off a little later and more bombers reached Yorktown, it could very well have ended at the bottom of the ocean. The next targets on the radar screen were more reassuring. The dive bomber groups, largely unscathed, were returning from their attack on the Japanese carriers. As the Dauntless aircraft landed, a pop-up window gave me the option to either go to the briefing or continue. I chose the former, eager to learn the outcome.
Final balance.
We achieved both a tactical and strategic victory, forcing the Japanese fleet to retreat. Midway ultimately survived. None of the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers escaped unscathed, and Kaga, in particular, was left in a precarious state. With its propulsion lost, the ship's aircraft were rendered inoperative, making it an easy target for follow-up attacks from the rear. Although I would need to reflect carefully to fully understand what went right and what went wrong, I knew I was utterly exhausted after this entire engagement. The stress of having so little control in a situation where a single minute's delay could alter the course of the battle makes the game tense, yet incredibly thrilling. Overall, Task Force Admiral brilliantly conveys the inherent tension of naval warfare. If there were a more user-friendly way to switch between 3D views, especially for reconnaissance and strike aircraft, the occasional pauses, even under time pressure, could feel a little tedious. The music hits the mark perfectly, evoking the feel of 1990s Spielberg-style war films, which is difficult to achieve without feeling overly cliché. Currently, Task Force Admiral suffers primarily from a lack of content. Upon release, it includes 2 main scenarios, Midway and the Coral Sea, plus 2 variants. At present, you can overcome this with the excellent mission generator, which allows for randomizing conditions, or the scenario editor if you want a specific engagement. Even in its current state, however, Task Force Admiral has already set the standard for visuals and mechanics in modern naval real-time strategy games. Closing remarks. The early access release of Task Force Admiral came out with a bang, offering a depiction of naval battles and aircraft carrier operations. This obsession with realism occasionally works against the game, and it struggles with the cumbersome interface issues found in most deep strategy titles. When the sirens blared and torpedoes closed in on my carrier, I wasn't even thinking about these flaws. War can be hell, but this is a strategist's heaven.